Welcome, everyone. My name is Ángel Muñoz, and I'm the co-lead of the Climate Europe 2 project. I am with the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. Okay, so welcome. Sorry, my understanding was that also Thomas will be joining. So we will start, and then probably he will join later. So this is group 2. And I think that you already know what we need to do. So we're going to be having a discussion. We should be back 15 minutes before 4 p.m. And our goal is to discuss these questions that you can see on the screen. And I'm going to read briefly the questions, but I think that you have already an idea of what we want to do. So the most important thing, please, I think that the easiest, because we are not too many and we have enough time, is that you just raise your hand and then mention any ideas, comments, or answers that you might have. In my view, a few of these questions are, will need more than the time that we have allocated, and a few of these questions are actually, a few of the answers might be it depends, but that is what we want to do. And then something that we need to do is to write one key recommendation. We can write more than one, but one key conclusion or summary from our session, so we can share it during the last 15 minutes before 4 p.m. But also the same message is going to be conveyed tomorrow during the last session of the Webstival. So that's just so you know, the goal here is to have this discussion, but also to write a clear one key message that is self-consistent, so we don't need to add too many sentences. Okay, so quickly, the questions are: what are your good and your bad experiences with climate services? Why are climate services important to implement adaptation at the local and regional levels? And what are the main requirements, suggestions, advice you wish to communicate to climate services providers? And to what extent can guidelines and standards enable the uptake of climate services to support climate adaptation? So we will have enough fun with those. And I assume that we can start with the first one. So good and bad experiences with climate services. Anyone want to start? Oh, welcome, Thomas. Sorry,
No, they have put me in the wrong group. Sorry.
Yeah, no, don't worry at all. Don't be sorry. It's just I apologize because I started.
Yeah, all good.
But please, Thomas, you want to introduce yourself? I already introduced myself.
Thomas Torek, part of the mission on adaptation implementation team. I'm running Fresh Salts Consulting.
Thank you, Thomas. So we will be facilitating the discussion, and I don't know how much did you hear, but I already read the questions and stated the goals, and now I don't know if anyone wants to start with the good and bad experiences with climate services. If you need me to move the tree a little bit to see what fruit comes down, I will start by saying that let me ask if we all understand what a climate service is, because that is not a trivial one. Although we might have a very good idea at this point. And also, good or bad, at least in my experience, also requires a reference. I cannot say something is absolutely good or absolutely bad. I need to describe with respect to what, just to start the discussion. I don't know if anyone wants to start. No one? Are you too shy? Is it my tropical accent that doesn't let you talk? Roger, thank you.
Yeah, I was hoping others would come in, but I'll start with some experiences I've had, and some of the earlier work that was done on climate services was where you get a lot of the bad experiences, and it's bad in that it wasn't able to support the adaptation decision-making process, and it was bad. The fact that it wasn't able to support is the information was provided was just data. Data was what was provided. And that continued for a number of years. And I even just prior to COVID, when I was doing some work in China, the difficulty is that what was provided was not the interoperability with the other information that was needed to make decisions was just completely limited. I mean, more time and lost effort was made trying to pull in climate information consistent with the other information that was needed to make those decisions, the socioeconomic, for example. And so it was it was very difficult and very frustrating for the people trying to make decisions. Now, the good that I've seen is where people, some of the providers or purveyors have worked with the people making decisions and tried to make, and they worked with them across the data sets and information that was needed to make that interoperability exist, or at least better. Better is what I could say it was. These are some examples that for local authorities working in Australia, where you could see that there was this link between them, and there was an individual or a group that was helping them make those decisions and helping them enhance that interoperability. So I found that, you know, the good, what I would deem better, was where there was a strong intermediary that would work with the individuals, that had an understanding of the decisions that they were making. Often even that person was sitting both in the providers or purveyors and the decision makers' offices, and so was able to understand and interpret and work between them. So those are two things that I would mention in terms of good and bad, and hopefully that'll stir some other people.
Thank you, Roger. As usual, very, very helpful. So in a way, here you're also talking not only about data interoperability. You have been, you know, giving concrete examples about that, but also like going beyond. Your last point was specifically about it. Isn't it? Like it's more about cross translation, cross interdisciplinarity, et cetera, et cetera. So those will be like, in a way, positive aspects of climate services that can improve what we want to achieve, if I understood correctly. Any comment, Roger, or anyone else?
I would just add that person or group that was able to sit within the organization making the decisions, but also with the providers of the information, and enhance that communication and built up the trust, was really important to enhance those, to enhance the quality of the utility. Quality and utility of the climate services was very important. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree. That reminds me of a lot of discussions when I was back at the IRI at Columbia University. We used to call these key people, and sometimes institutions, local heroes, because they actually make a difference. We try to avoid having one of those persons, because if the person disappears, then everything needs to be rebuilt. But it was very clear, and it is very clear, that when we have these local heroes, we can advance faster. Pete, please go ahead.
Yeah, a slightly different, at least a bad initial experience. We've been delivering climate services to a government department for about 7 years now, and it's broadly speaking in the area of food security. In the early years of doing that, it was actually really hard finding the right people within that department to work with, partly because of the cross-cutting nature of food security and climate right across a big government department. And so actually there were potentially lots of people involved. But the other challenge was that people, as a result, individual areas were somewhat reluctant to take overall ownership. And it's not a criticism, it's just no one was quite sure what to do. The positive thing that really changed that was that a particular area decided, yeah, okay, we will take ownership of this, we will look after it, and we will manage the relationships with the demands and the needs for climate service information with the rest of the department. But it was really hard to get traction, actually, and even to the degree to understand, Roger's talked about sort of numbers being given, but even to work out what numbers were wanted in the early days, what science, applied science we should be doing to support the decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. So we have a few hands. Mark, and then yeah.
I hope you can hear me a bit better now.
Better now, yes.
Good. The train's come out of the tunnel, so that makes things easy. I haven't had the bad experience, but my biggest fear actually is that we make a mistake. and something slips through and that people make a decisions on it. So anything that can sort of be done to improve quality and move towards quality assurance, all this type of thinking that you have in many other spheres, I don't feel has yet come to the climate services sphere. And so I won't say we're not responsible for the data that we put out, but we don't have the same quality assurance that you see in medicine or in many other fields. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts about that, and hopefully Climate Europe 2 can solve that problem as well.
Thank you for the homework, Mark. Definitely part of what we want to do, but we will need some time. I can add a few comments there, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I don't know if anyone wants to say something, or Werner, your contribution is related to the same topic?
Not directly. It was other examples. So I can wait.
Yeah, well, anyone, I can say a couple of things really fast. So yeah, Mark, I completely agree. Like quality, and then like having a set of recommendations or these standards that we want to have, and that go well beyond the standards that already exist, as you were mentioning, for data, or that are starting to exist for data in general and for climate data in particular. That's gonna take a while, and in the project we're still discussing how to conduct that. It is my personal view, based on experience, especially in developing countries around the world, that if we can identify, which is once I have my hand up because I wanted to talk about the demand that was just mentioned, I think, by Pete and you, Mark. But if we can identify the demand will naturally lead to this set of interactions that I think Roger has been pointing out, not only Roger Street, but also Paul Warty and many others, because a climate service is not only the provision, and I don't like that thing about users and providers, because at the end, the user is a provider and the provider is a user if we do this in a balanced way. But if we have these demands, so then, if we want a good climate service, good is defined, quality is defined in terms of the demand. And the entire capacity building, the entire set of interactions that we want. So the recommendation should be tailored, should be flexible. The approach should be flexible enough, but in a way that standards guarantee that the climate service is fit for purpose because it's satisfying the demand. So that will be, obviously, there are a lot of ways of doing this, but that could be a flexible way of how to achieve this, because in my mind, there is no rigid way to define standards that will work for every single case, because what could be a positive, we were talking about that before, experience or a good climate service for, I don't know, this particular set of decision makers might be completely the opposite for this other one. And I can give tons of real world example, but I'm just going to stop there. So we need that, but we still need to have a huge discussion, I think, in terms of what is quality and what are we pursuing with these recommendations or standards. Anyway, so my hand now can go down, and Werner, all yours.
Yeah, I want to provide another example of good and bad experience with climate services. To my experience, many climate services are based in research institutes, which are mostly funded by third-party funding, like the Horizon projects and so on. And they have to deliver permanently new projects, and they have to deliver permanently results to get new proposals accepted. And these projects are run mostly by scientists who work on contract basis. So they have a high career stress, and they have time 2 or 3 years for one project where they work with the population. And then they have to deliver results which have to be in accordance with the project goals, of course, because that's the business they are in. And this leads to that there are many projects around which lead to nowhere, which are forgotten after 2 or 3 years. People are left alone. It's just the short-term delivery of data, and then you have to jump back on your career pattern in the research institute. I think there are many climate service centers who work on this basis. That has to do with new career patterns in science and the adaptation of science to business models. And that's where the talk comes about consumer and clients and all that stuff, which is really amazing. We talk about people out there, but we turn them into clients because we are part of this business world in science now. I think we have to discuss that from time to time. Where are we working in? The other example I want to bring, it's also a bad experience more or less, is that climate services are working together with development aid in many parts of the world. That means development aid needs climate to run their business. And that very often leads to short-term adaptation measures. I just read a book about the Bengal Delta, where climate services, with the help of development aid, promoted the building of new dams, which led to negative effects on the local population in inland in Bangladesh, people who depend on water coming in and out. And it's called, there's a term for that even in anthropology, it's called misreading landscapes. There are also many examples from West Africa, where on the basis of climate data, measures are put into practice without proper consultation of local populations. And it's not only consultations, it's very difficult to find out how these landscapes work, especially in post-colonial contexts. It's very complicated to figure that out. And pre-major climate services activities lead very often to detrimental effects. So those were two negative examples I wanted to contribute.
Thank you, Werner. Indeed, really, really good ones, real life ones. Thank you. Roger?
Thank you. I've been thinking about, I've been listening to Werner, I apologize, but I've also been thinking about what Mark said and what you followed up with. And, you know, it leads me to really think about the third question. And I know I'm skipping ahead here, but I wanted to get this on the table. And it talks about to what extent can guidelines and standards enable the uptake of climate services to support climate adaptation? And we really need to think about this because it gets back to this question that Paco raised right at the start about liability. Liability when decisions are made. And I think that, you know, I look at it, and some of the examples that are often used are areas where the science is not, and the demand or use of knowledge and data isn't changing as fast and isn't required to change as fast as it is in the case of climate action and decision-making. And I think that we need to think about this. To my understanding, you know, I've been involved for a number of years, but only on the margins of development of guidelines and standards in various areas. And a key thing to understand with that is that a standard and even guidelines have a lifetime, and they only are invalid for a certain period of time, and then they're revised. So we have to think about that and how we put forward this idea of standards and guidelines so that they reflect the fact that these will change. And I think that that's a big thing to get. I think there are other examples where people are used to that, the changing in the standards. And I think we have to really think and learn from those other areas. Even in medicine, some of the standards that were introduced 5 years or 6 years ago are changing because we have a better science capability now. So I think we need to think about that and think about how we put forward this information that we're, you know, about standards and guidelines and what we're putting forward. And we really need to think about, because we don't want to have, you know, we don't want to enhance the potential for liability concerns. But I've always believed that what we need to do is to get at robust decision-making. You know, and people are used to robust decision-making. They're used to making, you know, that things may change. And, you know, and how we do that, how that change, I should say, and that need to change is embedded in the decision-making process. And I think that's I've often said, and I know I'm exaggerating here, but a lot of the adaptation measures we're putting into place now in the next 10 years will be maladaptation or insufficient at least. So I think we need to think about that and think about the climate services and the way we're supporting those and the way they're developing guidelines and standards that allows that change to occur and the acceptance of it. And like I said, always going after robust decision-making is much better than trying to, this is a decision and hey, that decision was wrong. Yes, it was wrong, and it's wrong. It wasn't wrong when it was done. It's wrong now, and therefore has to be amended, updated, or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. I think I completely agree. I just want to confirm that I understood everything. So this is aligned with what we were saying in terms of the demand. The demand is dynamic. I think that there are two things here. So one is I completely agree with you. There are a lot, I know, at least in my experience, I know far more examples of maladaptation or not so good, I'm going to call that those climate services than the more I don't know, effective or useful or quality ones. But if the basis is accepted to be dynamic because the demand will change, not only because science advances or sometimes stalls, but because the not everything depends on the demand. So if the demand changes, the climate services needs to change because it's supposed to be fit for purpose, which means that the way we assess the quality will be able to indicate, when we need to start like making those changes. And thus, I don't think that the standards is the only thing that we have. The standards tends to be actually far more rigid than maybe recommendations or best practices or guidelines, as you were also discussing. But then there will be I don't know, maybe it's too simplifying too much, but there will be a natural way to keep track through these monitoring and evaluation approaches of how often we need to update everything, the entire system, because the demand is changing. And then the second component, I said there were two, is about robust. So, the usual thing, I think that Werner will rejoice here, will be happy, because robust will mean different things for different people. So for me, something robust can be a business as usual. I will keep planting this crop the same day that my father and my grandfather used to do, because I know that it will provide at least this yield on average during the next 5 years or whatever. And that might not be the best decision, but the other option might not be as robust. So I don't know exactly what you had in mind for robust, if it's the same I'm saying, but I think that there are a lot of dimensions for how robust something is, even if it's not the best solution that we might want to find with a climate service.
Yeah, the idea to me is that I feel one of the big things that climate service has to do and should be focusing on is building capacity to use the information that's available. And to challenge that information is another aspect that has to be there. So that's one thing that I believe, and I think you captured that nicely in the first part. Robustness is another thing that, it as you say, as I think you'll understand, is that robust means something different to probably me and you and everyone else on this call. But robust to me means it is based on good knowledge. It's robust and it allows me to make changes to it as new information comes available. And it's robust in that it allows for differences from what I thought was going to happen. Changing government, changing a whole bunch of things. You're trying to take out the sensitivity to do those other changes that are there, and even in changes in the climate. Some of us, when we were doing the FAR and the SAR, et cetera, we were thinking, well, by 2030, this is going to happen. Well, it's happening now. Those things we saw in the FAR and SAR. So I think that that's really, a robust decision would have been able to look at that and say, okay, that's now happening, and we now need to deal with that. so we can make these changes, because I have the capacity and understanding of how to make those changes to the system. I don't know if that's enough, but I just thought I'd put that on the.
Absolutely. We are
Be helpful anyways.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So that's great. I don't know if anyone to react to what we are discussing, but there are a few, actually two questions in the chat. Pete and Mark mentioned that they agree with, the discussion that we had, and Thomas is asking two questions. I don't know, Thomas, if you want to actually,
Yeah, the first question is, to whom are these guidelines targeted to? Because what we know from the mission on adaptation is that the regions are not reading any guidelines. They just don't have the time and the knowledge for it. So whom are you targeting with these guidelines? And the second question is there any kind of evidence to which extent the climate services are taken up in Europe in the regions? Because I see a couple of cities using it, but the rural areas, most of them go maybe with the national data sets on climate projection, but that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone wants to address the first question or the second one first? I added something on the second one, but
I can just say a little something on that. It's interesting because I think if you went to the local authorities, etc., they're using ISO and they're using CEN guidelines and standards for a whole bunch of other things.
But not for climate.
No, I was just going to say they're using them because they're required to use them, and they have to use them and demonstrate that they've used them. But there is not. I agree. Nothing on climate. There's not. They're not a lot of them aren't reading it. A lot of them, even in some parts of the world, I can't say for all just in Europe, is that they go to a consultant and have the consultant take up that responsibility and do their job, do that job, and that's what we need to move away from. I'm sad to say, I'm pleased to say, I should say, can move away from using consultants. So, but I know that they are using and have to use ISO and CEN standards on other areas.
Yeah.
And there's just nothing I agree with you, though, they're not reading anything else.
Yeah. So Climate Europe 2 actually has the potential, and we already started, in that direction, to try to at least start a discussion and conversation with SAN, in these matters, because if there is anything related to climate, it's only about data and metadata, and climate services, as you have been and we all have been discussing, is far more than just provision. It's a far more complex network of that actually defines the service. Yeah, I'm going to agree, with everything. I don't have anything to add. Very good. Okay, so we are still okay in terms of time. I think we still have like 10 more minutes before we need to go. So perhaps we should use 7 minutes to discuss the next question, which is actually number 2. We kind of have addressed parts of it already, but then it will be great to have at least 3 minutes or so to decide democratically what is that key message that you want to bring back to the main session, and for tomorrow, the final session. I don't know, Thomas, what do you think? Federica, please.
Yeah, that's fine. I just won't be there tomorrow. That's, yeah.
I will do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
I will do it tomorrow. Don't worry. Federica, you want to actually make your comment?
I just try to write it down because I wasn't sure I could express myself in a I could make myself understood. I work in a regional environmental protection agency, and we provide mostly weather services, but also we are starting to provide climate services, mostly climate data, but also some indicators. And we often deal with people working in the local or regional authorities, and they believe they can use indicators from large platforms, adaptation platforms, but these indicators, this information, when we try to match it with our local data, they often prove to be not consistent with local data and local, local climate evidence, and also with climate projections that have been downscaled and biased. And so the big question for us is how to to exploit all these information provided by the big platforms and the big climate services, integrating it with our local data and experience and processing. And because when in these conferences, mostly people speak about big providers of climate services, but there is a whole world and ecosystem of local services. So how can we meet? How can we join these two different levels and scales at which we work?
Thank you, Federica. I have something to say about that, but anyone else maybe? So it's not always the few of us talking. Anyone has any impression or comment? Mark?
So I was just writing an answer. But there's a clear tension that you can kind of see between the European level providers like Copernicus and what's going on at the national level. And here in Denmark, and we see similar things in Norway and Sweden, where there are national level climate services. And it's obviously the national levels are much better at getting the local data and making sure that it's locally relevant. But we need to make sure that the two things play together. At the end of the day, they are largely the same types of information that have been presented in that way. So I think there's a sort of dialogue that needs to happen in both directions between those two. I don't know what the...
Thank you, Mark. Anyone else? So I think that you actually mentioned something important there. I think it's very important if we understand climate providers or the information providers as different than service providers, then maybe it helps with the question. But I don't know if I'm understanding this correctly. So this is my experience, working especially in developing countries. This is what I see. The usual approach is there is data or maps or some climate information and non-climate information available somewhere. And then independently, a service, because that's a service, they are serving the data, but that is not a climate service in general by itself. So if there is a tailoring of that information in order to build a service that is fit for purpose, then we are actually talking about a climate service. And it doesn't need to be prediction or monitoring, just a better understanding of what is available. This capacity building that Roger keeps bringing back to the table is also a climate service. What I'm trying to say here is that, to me, it is not the most efficient or the most successful way to identify a climate service just by saying there is some data over there from these big providers that are at this particular resolution, and I'm going to use a hammer and try to make it fit in my purpose, in my demand. The best experience that we have had is when we actually co-develop with everyone, the same level, decision makers, wide variety of those, like climate scientists, social scientists, the next generation who are like hybrids, working together from day -10 to day +100 on the same co-development of the service. If not, it's not going to work. If you think that this is like an old-fashioned clock, when you have the different pieces and they are not really interconnected or intertwined with each other, I don't think this is going to work. So in summary, I think that the way to address what you are mentioning, Federica, is that it's not just I go to the supermarket and I take these products and then let's see what I can cook with them. you know, that might be an option, but it's not, in my experience, the most efficient one. You need to sometimes start from scratch and sometimes use data that seems not ideal, but is the best that we can have these days in order to have a solution for the problem, in order to have something fit for purpose. I don't know if that helps. Roger or Thomas, I don't know who was first. I think Thomas.
Thomas.
Yes, I mean, practical experience I just made 2 or 3 weeks ago when discussing with DA the new dashboard on adaptation and vulnerabilities and adaptive capacity, and they were very clear that they can use only the Eurostat data they get reported from the national level, but they have no access to the local information that was described by the lady before, because it's just simply blocked by national authorities very often because they don't want to do this reporting and data provision exercise. And that leads to exactly the problem that what you see on Climate Adapt or the mission adaptation page, and the risk hub of the GRC is very far away from what people with a good climate services are producing on the local level.
I agree. Thank you, Thomas. And I think we are out of time, isn't it? What will be?
Yeah,
like...
we are. But Roger, I think Roger wanted to say a comment.
I'll just come in very quickly here. I apologize for coming in more than I wanted to. Just going back a little bit and looking at this question, there is one country where I've seen guidelines being used quite extensively by local authorities and by sectors, and that's in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. They developed, working with the authorities and sectors, a set of guidelines on how they wanted to develop their plans, the risk assessment in their plans. And they are following it. They're following it because there's peer pressure. They're following it because there's a requirement to do so. And this has guided the development of climate services in Ireland too, because some of the things that they're finding is when you're working at this local and regional level, you have to be able to be using consistent framing and consistent information all the way up to the national level, and in some cases beyond when you're dealing with transboundary. So this consistent use of information is very clear, is very, very necessary, I should say. But what is the useful aspect is the guidelines are always being looked at and were developed initially working with the people that had to implement those guidelines, and they're being looked at on a regular basis. And the services that are supporting it are also being looked at and being, you know, there's specific efforts to ensure that the climate services are supporting the users across the standpoint, the whole gamut from local, regional, and national. Sorry.
Thank you, Roger. I don't know if we have time. Mark, is that a quick one? We really need to...
Roger's example is very similar to the setup in Denmark, where
Go away, Mark. We can't hear you.
Yeah, we can hear the guy next to you, but not you. Sorry about that, Mark. Yeah. So should we go back, Thomas and everyone? Do we have a consensus on the main message to?
I don't think we have that.
We understand, Mark. No?
Maybe the only consensus is there are good and bad experiences with climate services, and that they need to develop further in an integrated way.
In terms of bringing, you know, considering the demand and something like that.
Yeah.
So, is everyone okay with that? Do we have an agreement, democratic agreement? Okay.
I got
so
one hand
maybe
up.
we should go back and then.
I think in terms of standards and guidelines, I think that what I've seen that's been very effective is they have to be co-developed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's what I meant with integrated. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I thought it might have been Thomas, and I apologize. I just wanted to make sure it was explicit.
Your English is better than mine. That's the reason.
Very good.
Question.
Yeah, that happens to me too. Okay, guys. So let's just go back and then Thomas, I understand you will present the main results, and I will do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone. A pleasure to have this discussion with you all.